It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 206, and of course, after several weeks of weather in the 50s and even low 60s and a lot of the flowers coming up from the ground, today we have snow on the ground, so good fun with that. Almost had actual flowers bloom, just the greens have come up, so I was waiting to see if we get actual snow on flowers, but it didn't quite work out. Just some fun for me. We spent the entire weekend cleaning like mad people to try to get our house ready for listing in the next few days, so fingers crossed that we will actually have time to get everything put away in storage or at least hidden in the garage. So hopefully soon we'll have pictures taken, have the house listed, and with a little luck, we'll sell rather quickly. A little later in the show, we have an interview with Helaine Olen. She was on the show about a year ago, and she has written a couple of books. One that was basically index card investing, everything you need to know on an index card. And of course, I couldn't resist making the same old tired joke. She wrote an entire book. In her defense, she did say it was a short book, and it's true. There's not a whole lot that you need to know, but things always get complicated, and so an index card idea turned into a book. And her previous book, Pound Foolish, talks about scams and ripoffs from the investment world. And every once in a while, people are surprised when I tell them how bad some investment things are. So it's nice to hear perspective from an actual investigative reporter who went out and did actual research and work and went to seminars and collected real information and not just me telling you how bad some of this stuff is. So we'll talk to her a little bit later on. One of the other things that I get on a regular basis when I'm talking to clients is, when do you start taking Social Security? So I wanted to go over some basic numbers. And I guess it won't be so basic, some complicated numbers. That's the problem with Social Security. If you didn't know, you can start as early as 62, or you can wait as late as 70, and somewhere in between, depending on the year that you're born, is your full retirement age, which might be stated as something like 66 and 9 months, just because the government likes to make things complicated. For me, to the best of my knowledge, because I just checked this for this segment, my full retirement age is 67 straight up, no months. So I'm going to be talking about that. And I'm going to use 3 different numbers, and I pulled my actual data. And it may vary. It may be different. I'm 50 currently. 62 is 12 years away. Wow. When did that happen? Just 12 years away. So these numbers will probably change, assuming that Social Security doesn't get broken between now and then. We have to kind of go forward on the information we have. If you are very concerned that Social Security will not be there when you retire, then that means you need to save all that much more. My basic rule of thumb is 20%, as long as you're not way behind. And I do occasionally have the client, an individual or couple, that will call me in their mid-50s to tell me that they finally finished paying for all of their kids to go through college, and now they want to start saving for retirement. And just in case you hadn't figured that out as a regular listener, it's a really, really bad fucking plan. It's going to be hard as hell to save between 55 and whatever age enough to retire. 62 is probably out. 65 is really unlikely, and 70 could be hard unless you can save 30, 40, 50% of what you make every year, or you can live on a whole lot less than what you make. Because at the end of the day, there's only 3 real variables. One, you can save more, 2, you can work longer. 3, you get to spend less in retirement. It comes down to really, really simple math. Anyway, back to my Social Security. If I retire at the age of 62, more appropriately, if I start collecting Social Security at the age of 62, my annual income will be $23,424. I don't know if that's the actual maximum at the age of 62, but I have paid the maximum Social Security for quite a number of years, so it's probably pretty close. Your results will be about the same. So, 23 to 24,000 is what you'll make at 62 if you have been paying the maximum Social Security, which I think now is $118,000 a year. You'll pay on that, and that's you and your employer. In my case, I pay both of those because I am my employer, so that's good fun. At the age of 67, my annual income could be $34,464, and at 70, $43,248. One of the problems that I have with Social Security, of course, is this complication of, well, when do I start? Because the more you wait, the more you make. And that's very tempting. And it is very tempting because do you want to make $23,000 a year or $43,000 a year? That's what I'm looking at personally. Your numbers might be the same. They probably aren't going to be higher because it does max out, but they might be lower, but the scale is going to be kind of the same. The longer you wait, the more you make. I don't necessarily like that, although I understand the rationale behind that, but I can work with that. What is probably even a bigger problem is that the more you make while you're working, the more you make in Social Security. Now, of course, you can argue that you paid more into it. You should get more out of it. All right, fair enough. On the other hand, a lot of social services, the whole idea is to kind of even the playing field. And if you've made really good money your entire life, probably the $43,000 is nice, but it's not going to change your world. Whereas someone who's barely scraped by and never made over $50,000 a year is not going to get anything close to $43,000. So they lived on $50,000, and then when they go to retirement, it's not going to be anywhere close to enough, and they're going to have a problem. But I don't know that it should be based on your income, but we can have that discussion. So those are certain things to know. Now, in reference to when should you collect, so one of the first things I wanted to do is just some math. I thought it would be simple, but it gets complicated. And, of course, the longer I think about it, the more variables I can come up with. So one of the things to keep in mind is that this is just for discussion purposes. We're just walking through some numbers. When it comes to your personal situation, you really should go to a local Social Security office, assuming there's one in your area, and schedule a time and sit down with an actual official representative of Social Security and make sure you understand all of the nuances, because there are lots and lots of rules. You can buy books about it, not a bad idea, because you'll become familiar with some of the terms and words that are used. But there's a lot of complications. So, for example, are you single? Are you married? Were you married before? How long have you been married this time? How long were you married before? What is your age versus your spouse's age? Will they collect more than you? Are you better off collecting half or part of their money versus your money? Are you or your spouse in poor health, and one of you might die earlier than you'd like? I guess that's all of us, but before the age of 70, are you better off to take money now and then get a death benefit later, or should you wait? All of those things get very, very complicated, and I'm not going to be able to address all of those, even a fraction of those, during this little discussion. So I'm going to look at my numbers, and like I said, at 62, I could start collecting $23,424. At 67, $34,464. So which is better? So what I did was I assumed that I started taking it at 62, and between 62 and 66, I would have collected $117,000. Now, while I will make about $10,000, almost $11,000 more if I'd waited, I also do not have the $117,000. So as you can imagine, it's going to take about 11 years. And I did the math. It works out at about 77. The total income I would get from Social Security, either way, works out to be about the same. Any time between 62 and 77, I am money ahead taking the money early. So life expectancy becomes very important. If everyone in your family lives into the 90s, that's a strong indicator that maybe you should wait. If a lot of people in your family don't make it past 77, then you probably should take the money early. But this is assuming that you take the money and then that you spend it. Now, the other thing is that, of course, if you need the money, if the only way you can retire, or if you're forced to retire and you have to collect Social Security, it kind of makes the whole point moot. You may not be able to wait 5 years to start collecting 11 grand more. If you need the money, you need the money, and that makes the decision for you. But if you don't need the money, but you could take it anyway, you would be ahead all the way until the age of 77. And that's assuming that you make nothing with the money, because if you didn't need the money, why would you take it? But maybe you should take it and invest it. So if you made nothing on the money and you just sat it in the bank, literally zero interest, you would break even at 77. But what if you made more? And let's go to the extreme. Let's assume you're going to make 10%. Well, the amazing thing is that $23,000 that I would make, if I took that and saved that and invested it for 5 years, by the time I started collecting money at 67, in comparison at least, I wouldn't have $117,000. I'd have $157,000, almost $160,000. But now I'm collecting only 23 instead of 34. So I'm going to adjust that. And what happens is that even if I pay myself the higher amount going forward at the age of 67, I never end up with less money. Matter of fact, my portfolio keeps growing and growing and growing. So in that scenario, if I take the money between 62 and 66, those 5 years, and I don't spend any of it, and I invest it in the stock market, and I make 10%. And you may not make 10% in those 5 years. I get that. We're just starting with an assumption. In the long run, the market makes 10. In those 5 years, it might go up. It might go down a whole. It might go down a whole lot. It might go up a whole lot. We don't have any way of knowing, but without knowing, we just assume the norm of 10%. And again, if you're 62, odds are you're going to live probably until your early 80s, maybe mid 80s. So you have 20 plus years, 20, 25 years, which the odds are really, really strong. You're going to make something close to 10. But okay, let's say we don't put it all in the stock market. Let's go to something where we say half in the stock market and half in bonds, making about 4%. So your blended rate on that would be, give or take, around 7%. So you make 7% every year on the money that you're getting, and then you start paying yourself the higher amount at 67. So you would still get your Social Security based on the number you started with at 62, and then you take a little bit out of the portfolio. Your portfolio would grow, but you're taking money out faster than it grows. And eventually, that money runs out at about the age of 95. Most people don't make it to 95. Now, you might, and then at that point, you're just stuck with the smaller payment. But in that case, with just a 7% return, with only half of your money in the stock market, you would be money ahead all the way up until the age of 95 by starting to take your money at 62. Probably the single biggest problem that might cause is that if you have a spouse that made materially less than you while working, and I talk to a lot of clients where one person makes 80, 100, maybe even 200,000, and the other one makes 30,000, or didn't work as many years, or doesn't have as much income credit in Social Security, and their Social Security payment is going to be much less than the other spouse. In that case, there might be much more reason to wait, because they generally will collect half of what you collect when you collect Social Security. So it's not just increasing the amount you collect, but you're also increasing the amount that they collect. Again, That's why you should meet with an actual person at Social Security to go over these details. So for me, especially with the newfound risk and volatility of Social Security being around, my bias, without knowing anything else about your situation, is you should start taking money sooner rather than later. But as I mentioned, there's always exceptions. And one of the things that people will often bring up is that, but if I don't need the money and I start taking it, I'm going to have to pay taxes on it. So I did a little research on that. And again, I am not a qualified agent. I am not a tax expert. I am not a CPA. But I did go to the SSA, Social Security Administration website, and I found that if you're filing jointly and your income is between $32,000 and $44,000, you will have to pay income up to half of your Social Security benefit. So if your marginal tax rate is 28%, you'll pay 28% on 50% of the money you make from Social Security. If you make more than $44,000 of combined income, you will pay up to, I know it's so complicated, up to, well, is it 85% or not? But up to 85% of your Social Security benefit may be taxable. And again, check with your own expert. But the problem then, of course, if you're making 25 or 23,000 and you're in, let's see, what is the interest rate I used here? The 25% tax bracket. You're not going to keep 23,000. You're only going to keep 18,500. And so that's a good argument to wait, again, because you're not going to collect 23, you're going to collect 18. However, the counter argument to that, because there's always on the other hands with this Social Security thing, if you're making over 44 grand, the question is it because you're working, or is it because you're working and your portfolio? And when you get to 67, do you expect to still be making over 44 grand? Now, I have dealt with some clients that in retirement are going to live on something less than $44,000. But a lot of people that have large portfolios, a lot of people who don't need Social Security in any way, they make more than 44. And in retirement, their goal is to make more than 44. So if you're going to pay tax at 62, and if you're going to pay tax on your Social Security income at 67, now all the numbers just are reduced, but the same calculations apply that we did just 10 minutes ago, where, again, you're better off taking money at 62. The big difference might be is that if you're going to live on 20 or 30,000 from your portfolio, but between 62 and 67, you can work and make 30, 40, 50 grand, you might pay a high tax on your Social Security income versus a low tax at 67, then you're more inclined to want to wait. But again, there's other variables. So hopefully that helped you understand an incredibly overly complicated issue. And I wish I had an easy answer to give you, but I don't. So without any interest, without any earnings, whether you take money at 62 or 67, the break even is about 67. If you wait all the way to 70, it worked out a little bit later than 77, about 78 years of age. So it all works out about the same unless you can invest the money. If you can invest the money, you might be considerably better off to take the money early, even if you don't need it. Anyway, more complicated than I was hoping to make that. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back and talk to Helaine Olen.
My father, the man responsible for my education, taught me that Islam, rightly understood, is a religion and philosophy of peace. In fact, he said that for any society to be peaceful and prosperous, it had to institute the rule of God, or Sharia. I came to disagree with my father. It was a gradual process that started when I entered and lived in societies such as the Netherlands and the United States that applied man-made constitutions and laws. Both countries are peaceful and prosperous. I now disagree even more with my father that Islam is a religion of peace. When I look at the amount of security that is deployed tonight here. The amount of security that is deployed for the Richmond Marathon. 6 months ago, the Boston Marathon was bombed by two brothers who invoked the founding documents and the founding father of Islam. I disagree with my father when I look at the wanton killing of the Westgate Mall in Nairobi by Somali men invoking Allah and Muhammad to justify their horrid act. Kenya is the most hospitable country to Somalis fleeing their own country, so it distresses me even more. I disagree with my father when I look at the reports this week of 30 men and women worshipping in Iraq who are killed by a suicide bomber invoking the very same God and the very same prophet that they invoke. I disagree with my father when he says that Islam is a religion of peace. When I look at the 120,000 dead in Syria, Syria is now a stage of a proxy war between Islam's two most important and most influential nations, the Sunni Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Shia Islamic Republic of Iran. I disagree with my father that Islam is a religion of peace when I read about the almost daily reports of the destruction of churches, the pillaging of Christian property, the rape of Christian women, the terrible exodus of Christians and other religious minorities from Muslim countries. All this is done by men who invoke the founding father and founding documents of Islam. I disagree with my dear beloved father when I read about the teenage girl in Pakistan who's shot point blank in the head by a man invoking Allah and Muhammad because she wanted education. In the name of Allah and Muhammad, women are forbidden to drive. They're forbidden to own their own reproductive rights. They're forbidden to do anything unless they have permission from a male guardian. I disagree with my father that Islam is a religion of peace when I read these founding documents and I study the history and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. In there, I find an insistence of war and intolerance towards infidels, the hypocrites, those who associate God with others, homosexuals, women, and so on.
All right, everybody, you're still listening to The Phil Ferguson Show, and with me today, I have Helaine Olen. She was on the show just a little bit over a year ago, but the audience has grown so much, I figured it would not only be fun to have her talk about her books, but she knows some things about things, so we're going to have some fun chats about the fiduciary rule. Helaine, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I am having the time of my life, just getting ready to sell my house.
Right. You're going to have to tell me about that after this podcast. I actually want to know more about this.
Well, we'll talk as long as you let me.
Okay.
Now, let's just go over real quick. Why don't you rattle off a few of the titles of your books and what they're about?
I wrote Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry in 2013. And that's about how Americans were sold on the idea that we could use personal finance and investment culture as a way to invest around income inequality and the increasing wealth gap between the top, 0.01% of the population and pretty much everybody else. I then wrote co-wrote a book with Harold Pollack, a professor at the University of Chicago last year, called The Index Card: Why Personal Finance doesn't have to be so complicated. And that's about how just some simple guidelines to personal finance and investments so that personal financial advisors and the banking industry and the whatnot doesn't eat your lunch when you're trying to invest what money you have.
Well, and if I recall correctly, that comes from a conversation the two of you had about what are the basics? And he said, or you said, it could all be written on one index card?
Right. So the backstory is Harold and Harold was interviewing me for a blog he writes for. This was in 2013 when Pound Foolish came out. And one of the parts about Pound Foolish is it's obviously quite a bit about the personal finance and investment industries. And one of the things I show is how they, have various and sundry shenanigans and make money on your investments. And here's how they do it. And here's what you should avoid, right? And Harold was interviewing me about the book. And at some point in the interview, he said, this is all so ridiculous. Everything you need to know about personal finance can be put on an index card. And he and I thought that was really funny. And we laughed for about a minute. And then we went on with the interview. And little did we know that people would start writing Harold and say, where's the index card? And Harold was like, what index card? And they were like, the one you talked about on this blogcast where you interviewed that woman, Helaine. And there was, of course, no index card. But after a bunch of these emails, Harold decided that he could make an index card. So he ran to his daughter's knapsack. And at the time, his daughters were in high school, and grabbed a Sharpie and wrote out some rules that we had discussed or on the show and some things from his own life and put them on the card. And the next thing we knew, the whole thing had gone viral, and hence the book.
I like it. And of course, the last time we talked, I made the joke about how you wrote an entire book about an index card.
Yes, and it was, and it's a short book, by the way.
It is a very short book.
I think it's about 45,000 words, because the fact is, this isn't complicated, and it doesn't need to be long.
Well, I know the industry loves to make it overly complicated, and I don't know if I told you this last time, but I regularly get emails or comments from people who accuse me of making things up, that things can't be as bad as the examples I give. What do you think? Are there some bad investment products out there?
There are so many bad things. There was an article this week in, I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer, that I'd urge everybody to look up. And it was about the world of equity indexed annuities, which is annuities as a rule are like the worst of the worst.
Yes.
Equity indexed annuities are the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst,
and
right?
If you put it inside of your IRA.
They're just sold to people in beyond inappropriate ways. They're a very high fee. For people who don't know what they are, they're extremely complicated. It would take about 10 minutes to explain it right now. But essentially, these are extremely high-fee, commission-laden financial instruments that are sold especially to elderly people who do not need them at all. And they are sold by advisors who do not have their best financial interests at heart. And if you are invited to a luncheon where these are going to be presented, and this is how they are often sold, is they financial advisors and other salespeople on the make send out notes saying, seniors, are you afraid of running out of money in old age? Come here and talk, right? Because, of course, they don't actually say annuity in the letter. And I'll tell you how you can save your financial lunch at this lunch. And you go and, they're selling this. And it all sounds, it's the answer to every problem you've ever had, basically. And these are things nobody or very few people should be investing in.
I agree 100%. Now, the thing that got me to call you recently was an article you wrote in Slate, and apparently you used to work for them. Is that what I understand?
Yes, I got downsized a couple of weeks ago. A whole bunch of us got let go. It was very sad, and if anybody knows of jobs, you can send them my way, please.
Excellent. Now, the title is Trump is Trying to Preserve Financial Advisors' Right to Rip Off Clients Saving for Retirement. And that kind of nasty, sardonic attitude really made me smile. So why don't you tell us about that? And then, of course, we can talk about what has happened recently. So this became suddenly even more topical than I expected.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing issue pretty much since the beginning of the Obama administration. As you and I know, but most of your listeners probably don't, there's no, for financial advisors, which is kind of this junk term that we all use, legally means nothing, people who seek out financial advice almost always believe that the person they are going to has a duty to act in their best interests, sort of like they're a doctor with a Hippocratic oath, except it's for your finances, right? This, unfortunately, is not the case in many circumstances. Well over half the time, they don't. And this is because people who give financial advice often work to one of two standards. The more common one is something called the suitability standard, which could best be described if it's sort of okay, it's okay, right? They don't have to act in your best interests as long as something is sort of okay for you. It can make them a lot of money. This is how those things that equity indexed annuities I was talking about a few minutes ago get sold. I always say it's like, if you're trying to buy a suit or a dress for a wedding, if you go to a store and they sell you something that sort of fits, needs expensive adjustments, and isn't really flattering, but you think it's okay, right? Fiduciary means that they work to basically the Hippocratic Oath standard, right? They have to act in your best interests. If you're buying the dress for the wedding you're a guest at, it has to actually fit you. And if it needs alterations, they need to be minor. The color needs to be flattering, and it needs to be within your budget, right? So anyway, most financial advisors work to the suitability standard. Most of their clients think they work to the fiduciary standard. This is a problem. So at the beginning of the Obama administration, attempts were made to bring this into line. And because of the way the financial services industry and the regulation of it is completely fragmented, regulation goes through two different departments, the SEC and the Labor Department. And the Department of Labor decided to take this on. The SEC never touched it. So this has to do, the Department of Labor is in charge of regulating retirement investments, not overall investments. That's through the SEC, okay? So they decided to expand the fiduciary standard so that it covers IRAs, 401ks, and any other retirement investment, right? And which is not true right now, okay? And they go through round after round of this. And the reason they go through round after round of this is because the financial services industry, which is making a lot of money on not giving people advice in their best interests, fights back furiously. And anyway, long story short, they finally get some provisions through, and they, at the beginning of May, set to go into effect in early this year. So what happens? I think we could all guess what happens next. The Trump administration comes into office, and they immediately put a delay on the regulations, and no one now knows what is going on at all. Right now there's I believe it's a 60-day delay. I would need to actually double check myself on that.
Yep. Just a couple days ago, they issued a thing that they're going to consider delaying for 60 days, and there's a 15-day review day period. So they're taking comments for 15 days to decide if they're going to delay for 60 days a rule that's supposed to take place in 30 days. Right.
And I should say here, and then they could decide to rewrite it or revise it. This is where it really gets strange and complicated and is probably going to be litigated out. The Trump administration seems to be an opponent of the fiduciary standard. It's actually not totally clear that they are. Trump, to the best of anybody's knowledge, has barely said a word about it. The most we know is that he did do this. He stood there with Ann Wagner, who's a representative from Missouri, who's a huge champion of not expanding the fiduciary standard, so that would seem to indicate he doesn't like it. One of his advisors, who was close to him and now isn't, is a Wall Street guy named Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch, as he's called. And the Mooch so hates the fiduciary standard that he compared it to the Dred Scott decision, which is, a slavery decision from the Supreme Court in the 1850s, which made no sense whatsoever, but clearly indicated he hated the thing. And we really don't know what they're going to do. But here's the complicating point, right? Even if they do something, it's not clear they even have the authority to do something, because this rule was put into effect in May of 2016, which puts it before the deadline where a new administration can come in and rescind a rule put in place by the previous administration. So the chances are incredible. If the Trump administration tries to do anything, someone will take them to court and this will all be litigated. Now, of course, while this is all being litigated, the fiduciary rule probably won't be in effect anyway.
Well, if I understand correctly, all it takes is Congress to vote a law that the rule doesn't apply.
Right, but it's harder because the regulation already went into effect, and there's two different ways you can do it. You can do it if it's within 6 months. You can do it through the congressional resolutions, and that's easier to get through, okay? if you do it, and they can't do it that way anymore because this was put in place in May of 2016. So they would have to just do it the regular way, and that would mean that the Democrats in the Senate could most likely filibuster it. And they probably would filibuster it because it is seen as a signature achievement of the Obama administration. So that way, probably, even though it's ongoing legislation in Congress, the chances are that's not going to come to pass. So this is probably just going to be a real mess in the courts. And at the same time, of course, the financial services industry is in some chaos because of this, because some companies made decisions and made changes based on this already.
Right.
Metropolitan Life sold off units they no longer wanted to deal with because they were going to have to give advice through them through the fiduciary standard. They didn't want to do it. Others, like Merrill Lynch, said, we're just going to comply with the fiduciary standard. Others have said we're going to wait it out. It is a total mess at this point.
Well, I'm stunned to find out that the Trump administration has made something into a complete and total mess.
I know. It's shocking, right? You can't believe it. You're like, really? The Trump administration? They're so well run.
Well, just what you've been telling me about how the rules work with the Senate, I'm now more optimistic that this rule will actually stick than I have been. I've kind of been going on the assumption that it's not going to stick. Now, of course, I guess someone could put undue pressure on the Department of Labor and they could change their mind, right?
They could, but again, it could go to the courts, and the courts could say it's too late to do anything. I have gone very back and forth over whether I think this will stick or not, and I'm not prepared to make any predictions. In the past, I said I think it would, and I guess I sound like I still think it ultimately will in some form, but it's not clear how it will stick, and more to the point, it will probably be some time before it sticks. Again, this was supposed to be in effect this April in a couple of weeks.
Now, I'd heard on another show and a different advisor talking about this rule, and they took the position that this rule will require advisors to disclose things that they didn't have to disclose before. And my thought was a little different, so you can be the arbiter here. My thought is that the fiduciary rule would require more clearly articulated disclosure. I mean, when you buy something horrible now, like the annuities you were talking about earlier, it's technically disclosed in an 80-page document or a 150-page document. So they're off the hook there. But under the new rules, it has to be disclosed more clearly up front, very, very, large font kind of thing before you even sign anything. Which way do you think is the most correct interpretation of that?
Oh, they do not have to tell you right now that they don't have a duty to act in your legal best interest. So by definition, the new rules are much stricter. I mean,
I understand.
You can look at those 80 pages, and there's no spelling out of the fact they're not acting in your best interests. Well, and that's a definitive change.
You're right. That is the definitive change.
That's a huge change. On the other hand, there's a question of how much it means, because one of the things we know from behavioral finance is that when people are told something, right, like I'm not acting in your best interest, to use the example that we're using, they'll then take the person saying it as that they're honest and they're disclosing that fact. And then they'll think they're more honest than someone who doesn't address it at all, which is bonkers, but that's why we're human, because we're bonkers, right? And so that is not totally clear how much it will help ultimately. The place where it will really help is the fact that people will have to act in somebody's best interests in more circumstances than they do now, and that this in turn will force a certain amount of good behavior, and this will definitely force some of the fees down.
I love that analogy you just made. It reminds me of fake medicine or homeopathic medicine, where they have on the package, this statement has not been clarified or approved by the FDA. Mm-hmm. And people who are against big pharma have learned to read that as being, oh, goody, this stuff is going to really work, and the FDA won't approve it. And so if I apply that same crazy woo-woo logic to financial services, I could see someone going to somebody and saying, hey, look, I have to tell you that according to these rules, this is not in your best interest, and I'm not acting in your best interest, but here's how this thing works.
Right. And I mean, to me, this is a perfect example of why you need such strict regulation, right? Because the fact is people who want to, can figure out all sorts of ways around this stuff. I mean, because there's another gaping loophole here, and this isn't the fault of the Department of Labor at all. The gaping loophole is that this only affects retirement accounts. And people who are wealthier, well, indeed, the mass of people, that is where most of their investment money is, and that will help them. People who are wealthier actually have a lot of money in regular old brokerage accounts, right? And there's really no such protection on them right now. And the SEC has said they're not moving forward with this. And that is concerning as well. Wealthy people deserve protection too. And there's this kind of blanket assumption that, they know they have more money, they know what they're doing. This, I can assure you, having dealt with my fair share of wealthy people and talked to them about money over the years, is not true. They can be taken for a ride just as easily as anybody else.
Well, I think it also applies to people that don't have a lot of money. As an example, if I have $10,000 and I'm married and I go see an advisor, a fiduciary advisor might say, you can open up 2 Roth IRAs and put $5,000 in each of your names, where someone who is a fiduciary only when they have to be could say, you should take that $10,000 and buy an annuity, because as long as they lock that money up before it gets in a retirement account, they don't have to be a fiduciary. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. But the issue is, of course, most people who aren't terribly wealthy, or at least mass affluent, as they say, there isn't enough money there for it to be a huge issue. So it's really for people who are worth at least $250,000 and up.
And then the other thing I hear from people in the industry is that this is going to force advisors, and I'm, again, using the terms very loosely, people who claim to give advice while selling you stuff, they will no longer be working for you because they're just going to refuse your business because they can't make enough money from you if you're small potatoes. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if that's the person you're dealing with, you're probably better off without them, frankly. It probably will force some people to not get help from financial advisors. But here's the thing. There's a lot of movement in that area. And there are people more than happy to still help small investors. And there's also the entire growth of the robo-advisor sector. And many people don't really need tons of hand-holding. They basically need an asset allocation. And that could be done quite easily through a robo-advisor.
Now, the other subject that you had mentioned before we got into the show and recording was changes in overtime rules. Tell me what's going on with that.
This is another, wonderful thing going on with the Trump administration. So the Obama administration updated the nation's rules on overtime last year so that it was, and I'm talking off the top of my head, so my numbers might not be totally precise, but roughly people earning a little bit more than $23,000 were not automatically entitled to overtime unless they were hourly employees. And that threshold doubled to just under $50,000 under the Obama administration. Again, that was set to go into effect in the end of last year. So what happened next? Somebody took it to court, and a bunch of people took it to court, actually, like a bunch of national employee organizations who didn't really want to pay the overtime, because this was going to be an enormous boost to many Americans' pocketbooks and wallets, right? And a judge in Texas stops this at the end of November. And it causes a whole mess because there were employers who had already given the raises to keep in, because again, this was supposed to taken place December 1st, and this happens the Tuesday night before Thanksgiving. So there were companies that had already given the raises. A lot of them left them in place. Some of them promptly rescinded them. Other places had known this court case was going and figured they'd take a chance and just not tell their employees what was going on, right? And essentially this is now frozen as well, and it is under appeal. But again, the Trump administration is giving signals that they might not go through with the appeal. So you have other labor unions and such trying to get themselves attached to the case now so that they can appeal it through to see if this ruling will stand, or we would hope be overturned. But again, this is also all in the air, and good luck, if you're not in it with one of the employers who gave the raise and continue to honor it.
I think that would just be so demoralizing, and I'm imagining these. You're giving someone a raise because you're compelled to by law, and then once you think you're not compelled, you're going to cut their pay back to what it was. That's not going to build morale very well.
Yeah, I found it astonishing, by the way. I truly found it astonishing that there were places that had told employees they would get raises and then rescinded them. I found that just unbelievable. But it did. I did a piece about it, and I found a number of people who had that exact experience.
Yeah, that's not that's not very nice of them, I guess. But how can people reach you, Helaine, if they want to send you a message or read your stuff? Do you have a website?
Oh, yes. It's helaine.olen@gmail.com.
Excellent. And do you have a website that has all your books and stuff on it, or should they just go to Amazon?
I do, but it's not updated anymore. I have to admit, websites feel a little old-fashioned these days, but it's helaineolen.com. I do keep a fairly active Twitter feed, so I'm at Helaine Olen. Come visit me. And I shouldn't be on there as much as I am, but I am, so there you are.
Too much time on Twitter,
there as well. And I'm writing for all sorts of different people right now. I still have a column at Inc. I did something for Rolling Stone this week. I'm around. Again, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see my stuff.
Well, that is fantastic. Are there any other topics, even anything unrelated to what we've talked about before, that are just inspired you that you want to cover for a few minutes?
Well, I'm supposed to tell you, because the index card came out in paperback this week, that you're all supposed to buy it immediately.
Very nice.
That's the topic that my publisher says has to inspire me.
You know, what you should have done, and maybe you did this, is that in the back page, it's a little perforation, and you can pull out an actual index card to keep with you.
I think we have an index card back there.
Oh,
we
nice.
do.
I didn't know if you had, but that just seemed like something that would go with the theme.
Yeah, I'm not positive it's in the paperback, but it was in the hardcover. So,
well, I think I had it on audiobook, so I didn't.
Yeah, and obviously on audio, there's no pullouts.
You just tell them on the audiobook that the last 1 minute is the note card, and just read it, maybe.
So, but that's what I'm supposed to tell you is that. So,
well, that's good, because of course selling books is how you make money, and writing stories, and since Slate is being difficult. Well, Helaine, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
The history of discovery, particularly cosmic discovery, but discovery in general, scientific discovery, is one where at any given moment there's a frontier. And there tends to be an urge for people, especially religious people, to assert that across that boundary into the unknown lies the handiwork of God. This shows up a lot. Newton even said it. He had his laws of gravity and motion, and he was explaining the moon and the planet. He was there. He doesn't mention God for any of that. And then he gets to the limits of what his equations can calculate. So can't quite figure this out. Maybe God steps in and makes it right every now and then. That's where he invoked God. And Ptolemy, he bet on the wrong horse, but he was a brilliant guy. He formulated the geocentric universe with Earth in the middle. This is where we got epicycles and the machinations of the heavens. There was still a mystery to him. He looked up and uttered the following words: when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies. These are the planets going through retrograde and back. The mysteries of the earth. When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. What he did was he didn't invoke Zeus to account for the rock that he's standing on or the air he's breathing. It was this point of mystery, and in gets invoked God. This, over time, has been described by philosophers as the God of the gaps. If that's where you're going to put your God in this world, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. If that's how you're going to invoke God. If God is the mystery of the universe. These mysteries, we're tackling these mysteries one by one. If you're going to stay religious at the end of the conversation, God has to be more to you than just where science has yet to tread. So to the person who says, maybe dark matter is God, if the only reason why you're saying it's because it's a mystery, then get ready to have that undone.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Well, once again, we're at that section where we wrap up the show. A couple quick thoughts. One, I think it was last week I announced that I had to raise my minimum for my business, Polaris Financial Planning, to $250,000. And I did get a couple of emails and calls from current clients that had below that amount. And I wanted to reassure them, and I figured I'd clarify here because I do know quite a few clients listen to the show. If you're already in, there's no across-the-board plan to kick people out that have accounts that are under $250,000. So that's not my intent. My intent was to slow down the pace of new clients so I could make sure I had time for existing clients. It didn't seem right to me to keep bringing in more and more people if I was going to not have time to answer phone calls and emails from people that are already paying me. That didn't seem fair to me. So by raising the limit, I allow in fewer and fewer people. And of course, those people have larger portfolios, so I still make money, but I want to make sure I have enough time to service and provide information and be responsive to people that have already agreed to pay me. So a little clarification on that. Another thing, just a quick reminder, on March 19th, so if you're hearing this before then, you can tune in live. I will be on the Atheist Experience TV show, hosted by the Atheist Community of Austin. And this show is seen around the world, and I will be co-hosting. And so far I've heard 3 different names of who will be the co-host, so I'm not going to try to guess. I'll just tell you next week who I was co-hosting with. And partly because of all the stuff I'm getting ready for moving, and I'll be gone for 4 days, my show next week may be late or non-existent. So it's just one of those things. If I get too busy, it could happen. So look for the Atheist Experience March 19th episode. I will be in Austin, and apparently it's the same weekend as, or same week time frame, I don't know how long this thing lasts, of South by Southwest. So I can now say that I have been in Austin during South by Southwest. I don't know that I'll go see anything because, I don't know, there's really large crowds don't appeal to me like they used to, but maybe I'll go see something. And a short 2 weeks after that, I will be going to a speaking tour in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., York, Pennsylvania, and over to the area of Atlantic City in New Jersey. So check out that out if you're in one of those local clubs or if you need information. I've talked about it on other episodes, so I don't want to bore you again with all of the redundant details, but that will be starting March 31st with the Washington area secular humanists, and then on the 1st, I will be in York, Pennsylvania, on the 2nd, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and then drive over to South Jersey humanists, and then the 3rd will be in Philadelphia. So I will be making a little bit of rounds in that area, and I have a day in advance where I'll be kind of just hanging out in Washington, D.C., and then a day after where I'll probably see some sites in Philadelphia. So looking forward to that. Again, thank you for listening to the show. If you've not done so yet, please help me out by leaving a 5-star review at iTunes or Stitcher, or if there's any other platforms that give ratings, let me know. And I look forward to seeing you out there on the road somewhere. Ciao.